In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets whisper through cobblestone lanes, a retired doctor is found dead, a glass of poisoned brandy by his side. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle smile, unravels a chilling mystery tied to a decade-old death. As cloaked figures haunt the night and hidden letters surface, she navigates a web of lies involving a nervous chemist, a guarded widow, and a family with a dark past. Will Miss Marple uncover the truth before the killer strikes again? Dive into a tale of deception, where every clue stitches together a deadly truth. Chapter 1. The Village Whisper. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, where the village seemed to drowse in the warmth of an August afternoon. From her window at the end of the high street, Miss Jane Marple surveyed the familiar scene. The butcher's boy cycling past, Mrs. Price's roses spilling over her garden wall, and the faint hum of bees in the vicarage garden. Her fingers moved deftly, knitting a pale pink shawl, but her eyes were sharp, catching every detail of the village's quiet rhythm. It was a rhythm that had shifted, ever so slightly, with the arrival of Dr. Clarence Haworth. Dr. Haworth had taken up residence at Willow Cottage, a charming but secluded house at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls hiding a small garden that had seen better days. He was a man of perhaps 60, tall and lean, with a face that bore the lines of experience rather than age. His eyes, bright and piercing, seemed to see more than they revealed, and his manner, courteous but distant, had set tongues wagging. The villagers, ever eager for novelty, whispered of his past. A distinguished career in London, they said, marred by some vague scandal in Harley Street. Something to do with a patient, Mrs. Pork, the seamstress, had confided to Miss Marple over tea at the Blue Boar. He left in a hurry, they say, retired here to escape the talk. Miss Marple, who knew the power of village gossip, listened with her usual mild expression, her mind filing away the details. She had seen Dr. Haworth only once, at the church fete, where he had purchased a jar of Mrs. Bantry's marmalade with a polite smile. But there was something about him, a watchfulness perhaps, that reminded her of a curate she had known in her youth, a man who had carried a secret he dared not share. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a way of unsettling even the sleepiest of villages. That afternoon, as she sipped her tea and adjusted her knitting, Mrs. Polk bustled in, her cheeks flushed with the excitement of fresh news. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess what I've heard," she began, scarcely waiting to be invited to sit. "Dr. Haworth's been having visitors, odd ones, coming late at night. Cloaked they were, slipping in and out of Willow Cottage like ghosts. My Tom saw them, he did, when he was coming back from the Red Lion. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. "How curious," she said softly, her tone inviting more. Mrs. Polk needed no encouragement. "Tom says one of them carried a bag, like a doctor's, but it wasn't Dr. Haworth, and the lights in the cottage were on till all hours. Mark my words, that man knows more than he lets on." Miss Marple smiled, her mind already turning over possibilities. In St. Mary Mead, late-night visitors were as rare as snow in summer, and just as conspicuous. The conversation was cut short by a sound that shattered the village's peace. A scream, high and sharp, from the direction of Willow Cottage. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her heart quickening, but her composure intact. Mrs. Polk gasped, clutching her shawl. "Good heavens, what was that?" Before Miss Marple could reply, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, appeared at the gate, her face pale. "It's Dr. Haworth," she said breathlessly. "They found him, dead." Within the hour, the news had spread like wildfire. Miss Marple, accompanied by Mrs. Bantry, who had rushed over with her usual vigour, made her way to Willow Cottage. The village constable, a young man named Harris, stood guard at the gate, looking out of his depth. "It's a bad business, Miss Marple," he muttered, lifting the latch to let them pass. Inside, the cottage was dim, its air heavy with the scent of old books and something sharper, more acrid. Dr. Hayworth lay slumped in an armchair in his study, his face ashen, a glass of brandy overturned on the table beside him. His eyes, once so keen, stared blankly at the ceiling. Mrs. Bantry, never one for reticence, peered at the scene with a mixture of horror and curiosity. "Poison, do you think?" she whispered to Miss Marple. "That smell. It's like almonds." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. The study was a scholar's haven, lined with medical texts and journals, a typewriter on the desk, and a small safe in the corner, its door ajar. A single sheet of paper lay on the floor, half hidden by the rug, bearing the initials LB in a hurried scrawl. She made no move to touch it, but her mind noted its presence, as well as the open window, its latch undisturbed. As the village doctor arrived to confirm the death, Miss Marple stepped back, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. Dr. Hayworth had known something dangerous enough to bring cloaked visitors in the night, and to end his life in this quiet village. She thought of the initials LB, and of two newcomers to St. Mary Mead, Leonard Baxter, the chemist with a nervous disposition, and Laura Belling, the widow who kept to herself. "People are so careless with their secrets," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself, as she and Mrs. Bantry left the cottage. The village whispered on, but Miss Marple knew that whispers, like threads, could be woven into a pattern that revealed the truth. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The morning after Dr. Clarence Hayworth's death dawned grey and heavy, as if St. Mary Mead itself mourned the disturbance of its quiet routine. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a cup of tea cooling beside her, her knitting untouched for once. Her mind was elsewhere, turning over the events of the previous evening, the scream that had pierced the villagers' calm, the grim discovery at Willow Cottage, and the faint, bitter scent of almonds that lingered in her memory. She had seen death before, too often perhaps, for a spinster in a small village, but there was something about this one that stirred her curiosity. It was not merely the tragedy of a life ended, but the sense of a secret, half revealed, that Dr. Hayworth had taken to his grave. By 10 o'clock, the village was abuzz with speculation. Miss Marple, stepping out to post a letter, overheard fragments of conversation at the grocer's. "Poison, they're saying," whispered Mrs. Weatherby, clutching a tin of biscuits. "Suicide, perhaps?" ventured Mr. Edge, the postmaster, with a knowing nod. Miss Marple said nothing, but her lips pursed slightly. Suicide was too neat an explanation, and Dr. Hayworth, with his sharp eyes and guarded manner, had not struck her as a man ready to end his own life. Secrets, she thought, had a way of making enemies, and enemies had a way of settling scores. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, her face alight with the excitement that only a mystery could ignite in her. "Jane!" she exclaimed, striding into Miss Marple's sitting room without ceremony. "You'll never guess. Inspector Craddock's here from Much Benham, and he's at Willow Cottage now. I've persuaded him to let us have a look, as friends of the vicar, you know. Come along. You must see the place before they tidy it up." Miss Marple, though she preferred her observations to be discreet, could not resist the opportunity. She donned her hat, a sensible black felt with a single feather, and accompanied Mrs. Bantry to Willow Cottage. The lane was crowded with curious villagers, kept at bay by Constable Harris, who looked harried but resolute. "Only for a moment, Mrs. Bantry," he said, lifting the gate. "Inspector's orders." Inside, the cottage was as Miss Marple remembered from the previous evening, though the morning light revealed details she had missed in the dimness. The study, where Dr. Hayworth had been found, was a small room at the back of the house, its walls lined with oak shelves groaning under the weight of medical books and journals. A heavy mahogany desk stood against one wall, cluttered with papers, an inkstand and a typewriter, its ribbons slightly askew. The armchair where the doctor had died faced a fireplace, cold now, with a brass poker leaning against the hearth. The brandy glass, its contents spilled across the table, had been removed by the police, but the faint almond-like scent still hung in the air, confirming Miss Marple's suspicion of cyanide. Inspector Craddock, a youngish man with a brisk manner and a reputation for thoroughness, greeted them with a polite nod. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," he said, his tone professional, but not unfriendly. "I'm afraid there's not much to see. We're treating it as a suspicious death until the coroner's report. The glass had no fingerprints but the doctor's, and the bottle of brandy appears untouched otherwise. No signs of a struggle." Miss Marple's eyes, mild but piercing, swept the room. The window, which she had noted the previous evening, was still ajar, its latch gleaming as if recently polished. The curtains, heavy green velvet, were drawn back, revealing a view of the overgrown garden. She stepped closer, her footsteps soft on the threadbare rug, and peered at the windowsill. A faint smudge of dirt, barely noticeable, marked the edge, as if something or someone had brushed against it. She filed the detail away, saying nothing. Mrs. Bantry, less restrained, pointed to the desk. "What about all these papers? Surely there's a clue in there. Letters, perhaps, or a diary." Inspector Craddock shook his head. "We've gone through most of it. Medical notes, mostly, and correspondence with colleagues in London. Nothing out of the ordinary, though there's a locked diary we haven't opened yet. The key's missing, and we don't want to force it until we're sure it's necessary." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the rug, where the scrap of paper with the initials LB still lay, overlooked by the police in their haste. She bent down, as if to adjust her shoe, and deftly slipped the paper into her sleeve. It was a small act, one she would not have admitted to anyone, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest details could unravel the tightest knots. The paper was crumpled, torn from a larger sheet, and the initials were written in a hurried hand, the ink slightly smudged. She straightened, her face as serene as ever, and turned to the inspector. "Have you spoken to the villagers about Dr. Haworth's visitors?" she asked mildly. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Visitors? We've heard nothing about that. Who mentioned it?" "Oh, just village talk," Miss Marple said vaguely, her tone disarming. "Mrs. Pork's boy, Tom, saw someone at night, cloaked, with a bag. It may be nothing, of course." She smiled, but her mind was already connecting the cloaked figure to the smudge on the windowsill. Someone had entered the cottage, she was certain, and they had known exactly what they were doing. As they left the study, Miss Marple lingered by the fireplace, her fingers brushing the poker. It was cold, but its position seemed odd, as if it had been moved and not replaced properly. She glanced at the safe in the corner, its door slightly ajar, revealing only a few envelopes and a bundle of banknotes. "Was the safe open when you arrived?" she asked Craddock. He nodded. "Yes, but nothing seems missing. The doctor wasn't robbed as far as we can tell. The banknotes are still there, and his watch and cufflinks were on him." Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. A man like Dr. Haworth, with his guarded manner and rumoured past, would not keep an open safe unless he trusted his surroundings, or unless someone had forced it open and left it so to avoid suspicion. Outside, Mrs. Bantry was in full flow, speculating wildly about foreign spies and secret societies. "It's like something out of one of Arthur's thrillers," she said, referring to her husband's fondness for sensational novels. "Perhaps Dr. Haworth was blackmailing someone. That would explain the poison, wouldn't it?" Miss Marple smiled indulgently. Mrs. Bantry's imagination was a force of nature, but it often galloped ahead of the facts. Still, Blackmail was not an unreasonable theory. The doctor's inquiries, whatever they were, had stirred trouble, and trouble had a way of finding its mark. As they walked back to the high street, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the initials L.B. She knew of 2 people in St. Mary Mead who fit the bill. Leonard Baxter, the chemist who had arrived 6 months ago, a nervous man with a habit of glancing over his shoulder, and Laura Belling, the widow who lived in Rose Cottage, her beauty tempered by a reserve that bordered on secrecy. Both had been seen near Willow Cottage in recent weeks, though neither had a clear connection to Dr. Hayworth, or so the village believed. Miss Marple, however, knew that connections were often hidden, like threads buried in the fabric of a shawl, waiting to be teased out. At the post office, she paused to exchange pleasantries with Mr. Edge, who was sorting letters with his usual precision. "A sad business about Dr. Hayworth," she said, her tone sympathetic. Mr. Edge nodded gravely. "Aye, Miss Marple. He was in here last week, posting a letter to London. Looked worried, he did. Kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone." Miss Marple's interest quickened, but she kept her expression mild. "Did he now? I suppose he had his troubles, like anyone." Back at her cottage, she retrieved the scrap of paper from her sleeve and examined it under the light of her reading lamp. The initials L.B. were written in blue ink, the same shade as the pen on Dr. Hayworth's desk. The paper was thin, almost translucent, as if torn from a notebook. She turned it over, noting a faint watermark. A crest, perhaps, though too faded to be certain. It was a clue, but an incomplete one, like a single stitch in a pattern she could not yet see. That afternoon, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, called with more news. "The inquest is set for tomorrow," she said, settling into Miss Marple's best armchair. "They're saying it's suicide, but I don't believe it. Dr. Hayworth was at the vicarage only 2 days ago, asking about old parish records. He wanted to know about the Granger family, Thomas Granger in particular. You remember Jane, the boy who died 10 years ago? Fell from a horse, they said, but there were whispers it wasn't an accident." Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their steady rhythm, paused briefly. "Thomas Granger," she murmured, recalling the case. The Grangers were an old family, once wealthy, now clinging to respectability at Thornfield Manor. Thomas, their eldest son, had been a charming but reckless young man, prone to gambling and drink. His death had been a shock, but the inquest had ruled it accidental, and the village had moved on, or so it seemed. "What did Dr. Hayworth want with the records?" she asked. Mrs. Clement leaned forward, her voice low. "He didn't say, but he was very particular. Wanted to know who was in the village at the time, who visited Thornfield. He seemed agitated. I told him the records were incomplete. Half of them were lost in the church flood of '15, but he thanked me and left. I saw him walking toward Thornfield afterward." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving new threads. Dr. Hayworth's interest in the Grangers suggested a link to his death. But what? Had he uncovered something about Thomas's accident? Something that someone wished to keep buried? She thought of the cloaked visitors, the smudged windowsill, the open safe. Someone had been in that study. Someone who knew how to move silently and leave no trace. Cyanide, she knew, was not easily come by, but a chemist like Leonard Baxter would have access, and a widow like Laura Belling might have secrets of her own. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting forgotten. The village was quiet again, but she knew it was a deceptive calm. Dr. Hayworth had stirred a hornet's nest, and someone had struck to silence him. The initials L.B. were a starting point, but they were not enough. She would need to tread carefully, to listen to the village's whispers and watch its shadows. In St. Mary Mead, as in life, the truth was often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience to see it. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Secrets. The morning of the inquest brought a chill to St. Mary Mead, the sky overcast with clouds that seemed to mirror the village's unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual pew at the village hall, observed the proceedings with her customary air of mild detachment. Her knitting lay in her lap, a soft grey scarf taking shape, but her eyes missed nothing. The hall was crowded, the villagers' whispers a low hum beneath the coroner's measured tones. Dr. Clarence Haworth's death, officially declared a result of cyanide poisoning, was the talk of every household, and the coroner's verdict, suicide, pending further evidence, had only fanned the flames of speculation. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. "Suicide is a dramatic gesture," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, who sat beside her, fanning herself with a handkerchief despite the cool air. And Dr. Haworth struck me as a man of precision, not drama. She thought of the open window, the smudged sill, and the scrap of paper with LB scrawled upon it, now safely tucked in her handbag. People with secrets, she knew, did not end their lives so abruptly. They guarded them, or they were silenced. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "You think it's murder, don't you, Jane? I knew it. The brandy, the locked diary. Oh, it's straight out of a novel." Miss Marple smiled faintly, accustomed to her friend's enthusiasm. "It is curious," she allowed, "that a man so careful should leave so many questions unanswered." As the inquest adjourned, the villagers spilled onto the high street, their chatter a mix of indignation and intrigue. Miss Marple lingered, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Clement, who was bustling about with a tray of tea for the officials. "Such a pity about Dr. Haworth," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "I understand he was asking about the Granger family before he died. Something about old records." Mrs. Clement's eyes widened, her tray wobbling slightly. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. He was most insistent. Came to the vicarage last week, wanting to see the parish register from 10 years back. He was particularly interested in Thomas Granger's death. You know, the boy who fell from his horse. He asked who was in the village then, who might have visited Thornfield. I told him the records were incomplete, but he seemed, well, almost feverish about it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over this new thread. Thomas Granger's death had been a tragedy, but not an uncommon one in a village where hunting accidents were part of life. Yet Dr. Haworth's interest suggested something more, a hidden truth perhaps, that had resurfaced with his arrival. "Did he mention why?" she asked, her voice as mild as ever. Mrs. Clement shook her head. "No, but he left in a hurry, saying he had an appointment at Thornfield. I saw him later, walking back from the manor, and he looked shaken, as if he'd seen a ghost." She lowered her voice. "Miss Marple, do you think it's connected? His death, I mean." "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. But her thoughts were far from idle. Thornfield Manor, home to the Granger family, was a place of faded grandeur, its occupants as much a part of St. Mary Mead's fabric as the church or the post office. Mrs. Granger, a widow of stern demeanour, and her daughter Eleanor, a pale, quiet girl, were not given to village gossip, but their isolation only fueled it. If Dr. Haworth had stirred up old wounds, it was no wonder someone had wanted him silenced. As she walked home, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a case from her youth, when a doctor in St. Mary Mead had uncovered a family's secret, a forged will, as it happened, and had paid for it with his reputation. Dr. Haworth, she suspected, had stumbled upon something similar, something tied to the Grangers and the mysterious LB. She resolved to visit Thornfield, but first, she needed to know more about the doctor's activities in the days before his death. That afternoon, she called on Miss Hartnell, a spinster whose sharp tongue and sharper memory made her a repository of village history. Miss Hartnell lived in a tidy cottage near the church, its walls adorned with samplers and faded photographs. Over a cup of strong tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Dr. Haworth. "Such a shock, his passing," she said, her needles clicking softly. I heard he was quite active in the village, asking questions about old families. Miss Hartnell's eyes gleamed with the joy of imparting knowledge. Oh yes, he was nosy, that one. Came to me last month wanting to know about the Grangers, Thomas in particular. I told him what everyone knows. The boy was wild, always in debt, and that fall from his horse was no surprise. But Dr. Hayworth kept asking about visitors to Thornfield around that time. Said he was writing a medical history or some such nonsense. I didn't believe it for a moment. Miss Marple's interest quickened, but she kept her tone casual. Visitors? Did he mention anyone in particular? Not by name, Miss Hartnell said, pursing her lips. But he asked about a chemist who used to work at Baxter's shop, before Leonard Baxter took it over, you know. And he was curious about Mrs. Belling, the widow at Rose Cottage. Wanted to know if she'd ever been to Thornfield. I told him she keeps to herself, but I've seen her walking near the manor once or twice. Odd, don't you think? Very odd, Miss Marple agreed, her mind racing. Leonard Baxter and Laura Belling again. The initials LB seemed to follow her like a shadow. She thanked Miss Hartnell and left, her thoughts turning to the chemist's shop on the high street. Leonard Baxter was a newcomer, having arrived only 6 months ago, and his nervous demeanour had not gone unnoticed. If Dr. Hayworth had been asking about a previous chemist, perhaps there was a connection to Thomas Granger's death, a connection that had resurfaced with deadly consequences. The chemist's shop was a small, cluttered space, its shelves lined with bottles and jars, the air heavy with the scent of lavender and antiseptic. Leonard Baxter, a thin man with spectacles that magnified his anxious eyes, was behind the counter sorting prescriptions. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his hands fumbling with a vial. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice high with strain. "Can I help you?" "I thought I'd try some of that lavender water you recommended," Miss Marple said, her smile as gentle as a summer breeze. As he fetched the bottle, she added casually, "Such a sad business about Dr. Hayworth. I understand he visited you recently." Baxter's hand jerked, and the vial slipped, rolling across the counter. He caught it just in time, his face flushed. "Oh yes, he came in once or twice. Wanted some headache powders, that's all." His eyes darted to the door, as if expecting someone to burst in. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but she noted his unease. "He was quite curious about the village, wasn't he? I heard he was asking about old records, perhaps even about the chemist who worked here before you." Baxter's face paled, and he busied himself with the lavender water, wrapping it in brown paper. "I wouldn't know about that," he said quickly. "I've only been here 6 months. The old chemist, Mr. Tate, moved to London. Dr. Hayworth never mentioned him." But his voice trembled, and Miss Marple saw the lie in his eyes, as clear as day. She paid for the lavender water and left, her mind weaving new patterns. Baxter's nervousness suggested he knew more than he admitted, and Dr. Hayworth's questions about the previous chemist hinted at a link to Thomas Granger's death. Cyanide, she knew, was a chemist's tool, used for pest control, but deadly in the wrong hands. Had Dr. Hayworth uncovered evidence of poison in Thomas's case? And if so, who had reason to keep it hidden? That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts far from idle. The village was full of secrets, she knew, but Dr. Hayworth's had been dangerous enough to cost him his life. She thought of the Grangers, Mrs. Granger with her stern dignity, and Eleanor with her haunted eyes. Thornfield Manor held answers, she was certain, and she resolved to visit the next day, under the guise of collecting for the church fund. But she would need to be careful. Whoever had poisoned Dr. Hayworth was still in St. Mary Mead, watching, waiting. As she turned down her lamp, Miss Marple's gaze fell on the scrap of paper with LB. She had not shown it to Inspector Craddock, not yet. It was a small thing, but in her experience, small things could unravel the tightest knots. She thought of a young woman she had known years ago, a governess who had kept a secret that led to tragedy. "People are so predictable," she murmured, her needles clicking softly in the quiet, "and yet so very careless." Chapter 4. A Visit to Thornfield. The September sun broke through the morning mist as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the winding lane to Thornfield Manor, her black handbag swinging gently at her side. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading roses, and her sensible shoes crunched softly on the gravel path. She carried a small notebook, ostensibly for collecting subscriptions for the church restoration fund, but her true purpose was to observe the Granger household, where Dr. Clarence Hayworth's inquiries had led him days before his death. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needles in her knitting bag, was alive with questions. The doctor's interest in Thomas Granger's death, the initials L.B., and the nervous demeanour of Leonard Baxter all pointed to Thornfield as the heart of the mystery. Thornfield Manor stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, its grey stone facade half hidden by ancient yews and overgrown ivy. Once a symbol of the Granger family's wealth, it now bore the marks of neglect. Cracked windows, a sagging gate, and a garden where weeds choked the flower beds. Miss Marple, who had visited years ago during a charity bazaar, noted the decline with a pang of regret. Families, like houses, could crumble under the weight of their secrets, and she suspected the Grangers held more than their share. She rang the bell, its chime echoing faintly within, and was met by a maid, a young woman with a pinched face and eyes that darted nervously. "Mrs. Granger is in the drawing room, miss," she said, leading Miss Marple through a dim hall lined with portraits. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood and lavender polish, and the silence was broken only by the distant tick of a grandfather clock. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the faded grandeur, a chipped vase on a side table, a rug worn thin at the edges, and a door to what she guessed was a study, slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of books and papers. Mrs. Granger received her in the drawing room, a cavernous space with high windows and heavy drapes that seemed to absorb the light. She was a tall woman, her silver hair pulled tightly back, her face etched with lines of pride and sorrow. Beside her sat Eleanor, her daughter, a pale young woman of 25, whose delicate features were marred by a tension that made her hands flutter like trapped birds. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Granger said, her voice cool but polite. "How kind of you to call. I suppose it's about the church fund." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her smile as gentle as a summer breeze. She opened her notebook, making a show of checking her list. "We're hoping to repair the vestry roof before winter, but I won't take much of your time. Such a sad business about Dr. Hayworth, isn't it? I understand he visited you recently." Mrs. Granger's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. "Yes, he called last week," she said evenly. "A courtesy visit, nothing more. He was new to the village, after all." Eleanor, however, gave a small start, her eyes flicking to a locked drawer in a rosewood desk by the window. Miss Marple, who missed nothing, noted the glance and the faint flush that rose to Eleanor's cheeks. "How thoughtful of him," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. "He seemed such a curious man, always asking questions. I heard he was interested in old village matters, family histories, that sort of thing." She paused, her eyes soft but searching. "Perhaps he mentioned Thomas." The name hung in the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. Mrs. Granger's face hardened, and Eleanor's hands stilled, clutching her skirt. "My son's death was a tragedy," Mrs. Granger said, her voice like ice. "An accident, as the inquest ruled. Dr. Hayworth had no business dredging up the past." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of fear, like a thread pulled too tight. Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was kind, Mother. He only wanted to help." Mrs. Granger shot her daughter a sharp look, and Eleanor fell silent, her eyes dropping to her lap. Miss Marple, Sensing the tension, changed tack. "Of course," she said. "It's only natural to want closure. I remember Thomas as such a spirited boy, so like my nephew Raymond in his younger days, always full of life, though perhaps a bit reckless." Mrs. Granger's lips thinned, but she said nothing. Miss Marple, undeterred, continued in her gentle, rambling way. "I suppose Dr. Haworth was looking into medical matters. Being a doctor, perhaps something about the accident puzzled him." She let the question linger, her eyes on Eleanor, who seemed to shrink into her chair. "He asked about the day Thomas died," Eleanor said suddenly, ignoring her mother's warning glance. "He wanted to know who was at Thornfield, what medicines were given. I told him it was just the family and the doctor, Dr. Tate, who used to run the chemist's shop. But he kept pressing, as if he thought—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Mrs. Granger stood abruptly, her movement as sharp as a snapped twig. "Eleanor, that's enough. Miss Marple, I'm afraid we're rather busy today. I'll make a donation to the church fund, of course. Let me see you out." Her tone left no room for argument, but Miss Marple's mild smile did not waver. She closed her notebook, thanked them for their time, and followed Mrs. Granger to the door, her mind cataloguing every detail. Eleanor's nervous glance at the desk, Mrs. Granger's controlled anger, and the mention of Dr. Tate, the former chemist. As she stepped into the hall, Miss Marple paused by a side table, pretending to admire a vase. Her eyes, however, were on the study door, still ajar. She glimpsed a desk piled with papers, and a small locked box, its brass gleaming in the dim light. "Such a lovely home," she said, her voice bright, "though it must be a trial to maintain. I suppose you have many visitors, family friends and such." She let the question hang, watching Mrs. Granger's reaction. "Few enough," Mrs. Granger said curtly. "We value our privacy." But Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in her eyes, as if the question had struck too close to a hidden truth. As the maid showed her out, Miss Marple glanced back at the manor, her gaze lingering on the upper windows. A curtain twitched, and for a moment she thought she saw Eleanor's pale face, watching her departure. The lane back to the village was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a cuckoo. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the morning's observations. Eleanor's nervousness, Mrs. Granger's defensiveness, and the locked drawer suggested a secret tied to Thomas's death, a secret Dr. Haworth had uncovered. The mention of Dr. Tate, the former chemist, was another thread, one that connected to Leonard Baxter's shop and perhaps to the cyanide that had ended Dr. Haworth's life. She recalled the initials LB on the scrap of paper and wondered if they pointed to someone else entirely, someone who had been at Thornfield 10 years ago. As she neared the village, Miss Marple spotted a familiar figure by the gate to Thornfield's grounds. Leonard Baxter, his coat flapping in the breeze, his face flushed with agitation. He was pacing, muttering to himself, and did not notice her until she was almost upon him. "Mr. Baxter," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you seem troubled. Is everything all right?" He started, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Oh, Miss Marple. I was just out for a walk. The air, it's good for the nerves." But his hands trembled, and his eyes darted toward Thornfield, as if drawn by an invisible force. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her smile as warm as ever. "It's a fine day for it, though I imagine Thornfield's grounds are quite private. Have you been visiting Mrs. Granger?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, noting the sweat on his brow. No, he said quickly, too quickly. "Just passing by. I must get back to the shop." He tipped his hat and hurried off, his footsteps uneven on the gravel. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind adding another stitch to the pattern. Baxter's presence at Thornfield was no coincidence, she was certain, and his fear suggested he knew more than he dared admit. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from idle. She thought of a case from her girlhood, when a young man in her village had died under mysterious circumstances, his family closing ranks to protect a secret. The Grangers, she suspected, were doing the same, and Dr. Hayworth had paid the price for prying too closely. The locked drawer in the drawing room, Eleanor's haunted eyes, and Baxter's agitation were all pieces of the puzzle, but the picture was not yet clear. She would need to tread carefully, for the person who had poisoned Dr. Hayworth was still in St. Mary Mead, and they would not hesitate to strike again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Miss Marple opened her handbag and took out the scrap of paper with LB. She turned it over in her fingers, her eyes narrowing. "Secrets," she murmured, "are like weeds. They grow in the dark, but they always leave a trace." She set the paper aside and picked up her needles, her mind already planning her next move. Chapter 5. The Chemist's Confession. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat, her knitting idle for the moment. Outside, St. Mary Mead stirred with its usual rhythm. The milk cart rattled down the high street, and Mrs. Price's terrier yapped at a passing bicycle. But Miss Marple's thoughts were far from the village's daily hum. Her visit to Thornfield Manor had left her with a sense of unease, like a dropped stitch in a carefully knitted shawl. Mrs. Granger's icy composure, Eleanor's nervous glance at the locked drawer, and Leonard Baxter's agitated presence by the manor gate had woven a pattern in her mind, one that pointed to a secret buried deep in the Granger family's past, a secret Dr. Clarence Hayworth had uncovered, to his peril. The scrap of paper with LB still lay in her handbag, its blue ink a silent accusation. Miss Marple had not yet shared it with Inspector Craddock, preferring to unravel its meaning herself. The initials could belong to Leonard Baxter, the chemist, or Laura Belling, the widow, but they might also point to someone else entirely, a forgotten figure from Thomas Granger's time. Her encounter with Baxter yesterday had confirmed her suspicions. His fear was not that of an innocent man. She resolved to visit his chemist's shop that afternoon, under the guise of purchasing a remedy, to see what more she could learn. After a light lunch of tea and scones, Miss Marple donned her tweed coat and set out for the high street. The village was abuzz with talk of the inquest's suicide verdict, but she heard murmurs of doubt in the grocer's queue. "Dr. Hayworth wasn't the sort," said Mrs. Weatherby, clutching a bag of flour. "Too sharp, too curious." Miss Marple nodded absently, her mind on Baxter's shop, which stood at the corner of the high street. Its green-painted sign faded but legible. Baxter's Chemist, Prescriptions and Remedies. Inside, the shop was dim, its air thick with the scents of camphor and lavender. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with bottles, jars, and packets of powders, their labels curling at the edges. Leonard Baxter stood behind the counter, his spectacles glinting in the weak light, his hands sorting a tray of vials with a precision that belied his nervous demeanour. He looked up as the bell above the door jingled, his face tightening at the sight of Miss Marple. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice high and strained. "Back so soon? Is the lavender water to your liking?" "Oh, quite satisfactory," Miss Marple said, her smile as gentle as a summer breeze. "But I've been feeling a touch of indigestion lately. Perhaps you have something for it?" She moved to the counter, her eyes scanning the shelves, noting a small, locked cabinet in the corner, its glass door revealing rows of bottles marked with warning labels. Poisons, she thought, her mind flicking to the cyanide that had ended Dr. Hayworth's life. Baxter fumbled with a bottle of bicarbonate of soda, nearly dropping it. "Indigestion, yes. This should do," he said, wrapping it in brown paper. His hands trembled, and his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting an interruption. Miss Marple, with her knack for disarming the wary, leaned forward slightly. "Such a sad business about Dr. Haworth," she said, her tone sympathetic. "He was in here, wasn't he? Asking about medicines, perhaps?" Baxter's face paled, and the bottle slipped from his grasp, rolling across the counter. He caught it, his fingers clumsy. He came in once or twice," he stammered. "Just for headache powders, like I told you. Nothing unusual." But his voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw the fear in his eyes, as clear as the glass vials behind him. She pressed gently, her voice soft but persistent. "I heard he was curious about poisons, cyanide in particular. It's such a dangerous thing, isn't it? Not something one would sell lightly." She paused, watching his reaction. Baxter's hands froze, and a bead of sweat glistened on his forehead. For a moment, she thought he might bolt, but he seemed to crumple, his shoulders sagging. He asked about cyanide, Baxter blurted, his voice barely above a whisper. Not for himself, mind you. He wanted to know about old records, from before my time. Said he was researching a case, something about a death years ago. I told him I didn't know anything, but he kept pressing, asking about Mr. Tate, the old chemist. He stopped, his eyes wide with panic, as if realizing he had said too much. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was racing. "Mr. Tate," she said, as if the name were new to her. "He ran this shop before you, didn't he? I suppose Dr. Haworth thought he might have sold something unusual all those years ago." She let the words hang, watching Baxter's face. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I told him Tate's records were gone, destroyed in a fire, but he wouldn't let it go. He came back 2 days before he died, asking if anyone had bought cyanide under the name LB. I said no, of course. It's not something we'd sell to just anyone. It's for pest control, you see, strictly regulated." His voice was pleading now, as if begging her to believe him. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. "Of course," she said. "Though it's curious, isn't it, that he was so specific about those initials. LB. It could be anyone, I suppose." She paused, noting the way Baxter's hands clenched the counter. "You've been to Thornfield recently, haven't you? I saw you by the gate yesterday." Baxter flinched, as if struck. I was just passing by," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I had no business there. I swear it, Miss Marple." His eyes darted to the locked cabinet, and Miss Marple followed his gaze, her mind noting the gesture. Cyanide, she knew, was kept in such cabinets, under lock and key, but a chemist with access could easily procure it. She paid for the bicarbonate of soda, her smile unwavering. "Thank you, Mr. Baxter," she said. "You've been most helpful. I do hope you're not too troubled by all this talk of poison." She turned to leave, but paused at the door, as if struck by a sudden thought. "Oh, one more thing. Did Dr. Haworth ever mention the Granger family? Thomas Granger, perhaps?" Baxter's face drained of colour, and for a moment she thought he might faint. "No," he said, too quickly. "Never. I must get back to work." He turned away, busying himself with the vials, but Miss Marple saw the tremor in his hands, the fear that clung to him like a shadow. As she stepped into the sunlight, Miss Marple's mind was alive with possibilities. Baxter's confession, reluctant though it was, had confirmed her suspicions. Dr. Haworth had been digging into Thomas Granger's death, and his questions about cyanide and the initials LB suggested a link to the chemist's shop. But was Baxter the LB of the note, or was he merely a frightened bystander, caught in a web he did not fully understand? She thought of Laura Belling, the widow whose name also fit the initials, and resolved to visit her next. But first, she needed to know more about Mr. Tate, the former chemist, and his role in the village 10 years ago. That evening, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Bantry, who was in her element, regaling her with theories about Dr. Haworth's death. "It's blackmail, Jane, I'm sure of it," she said, waving a copy of the Times. "He knew something about the Grangers, and they silenced him." Miss Marple smiled, letting her friend's enthusiasm run its course. "Perhaps," she said, "but we mustn't jump to conclusions. I've been thinking about Mr. Tate, the old chemist. Do you remember him?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, her memory less precise than Miss Marple's. "Vaguely. A quiet man, wasn't he? Left for London after Thomas Granger's death. There was talk he'd been ill, or in debt, something like that." She brightened. "Do you think he's involved?" "Oh, Jane, this is getting positively thrilling." Miss Marple's smile was indulgent, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Tate's departure after Thomas's death was no coincidence, she suspected, and Baxter's fear suggested he knew more about his predecessor than he admitted. She recalled a case from her youth when a village apothecary had been implicated in a poisoning, his records conveniently lost. "History," she murmured, "has a way of repeating itself." As she walked home under the starlit sky, Miss Marple's mind turned to the locked cabinet in Baxter's shop, the initials LB, and the shadow of Thornfield Manor. Baxter's confession had been a step forward, but it was only a thread in a larger tapestry. Someone had procured cyanide, someone had slipped into Willow Cottage, and someone had ensured Dr. Haworth's silence. She thought of Eleanor Granger's haunted eyes and Mrs. Granger's steely control, and wondered which of them, or someone else entirely, had the most to lose. Chapter 6. The Widow's Tale. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobblestone lanes as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Rose Cottage, home of Laura Belling. The air was cool, with a hint of autumn in the breeze, and the village seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the undercurrents of unease that rippled beneath its surface. Miss Marple's encounter with Leonard Baxter had left her with more questions than answers. His nervous confession about Dr. Haworth's inquiries into cyanide and the initials LB had tightened the knot of the mystery, but it was Laura Belling, the enigmatic widow, who now occupied her thoughts. The initials on the scrap of paper could point to her as easily as to Baxter, and Miss Marple's instinct told her that Rose Cottage held a piece of the puzzle. Rose Cottage stood at the outskirts of the village, a small ivy-clad house with a neatly tended garden, its roses still blooming despite the season's turn. It was a place of quiet beauty, but there was a stillness about it that spoke of solitude rather than peace. Laura Belling, who had arrived in St. Mary Mead a year ago, was a figure of fascination to the villagers. Her beauty, dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that seemed to see too much, was tempered by a reserve that discouraged familiarity. Gossip painted her as a widow grieving a husband lost in mysterious circumstances, and Dr. Haworth's interest in her, as Miss Hartnell had mentioned, suggested a connection to his fatal inquiries. Miss Marple knocked softly, her handbag clutched in one hand, a basket of apples from her garden in the other, a pretext for her visit. The door opened to reveal Laura Belling, dressed in a simple grey frock that did nothing to diminish her striking presence. Her eyes, a deep green, met Miss Marple's with a guarded curiosity. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and melodic. "What a pleasant surprise. Please come in." The sitting room was modest but elegant, with a single vase of roses on the mantel and a small fire crackling in the hearth. Miss Marple noted the absence of personal touches. No photographs, no mementos, only a locket that Laura wore at her throat, her fingers brushing it absently as she offered tea. "These are for you," Miss Marple said, setting the apples on the table. "My tree has been rather generous this year." "How kind," Laura said, her smile polite but distant. She poured tea from a chipped porcelain pot, her movements graceful but deliberate, as if every gesture were calculated. Miss Marple, Settling into a worn armchair, let the silence stretch, her eyes soft but watchful. She had learned long ago that silence could be as revealing as words, and Laura's composure, she sensed, was a fragile thing. "It's been a difficult week for the village," Miss Marple said at last, her tone gentle. "Dr. Hayworth's death has set everyone talking. I understand you knew him in London." She sipped her tea, her gaze steady over the rim of the cup. Laura's hand paused, the teaspoon clinking faintly against the saucer. "Yes," she said, her voice even but tinged with caution. "He treated my late husband, Richard, some years ago. A kind man, but overly curious, perhaps." Her fingers tightened on the locket, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, wondering what it held. A photograph, perhaps, or a lock of hair. "Curiosity can be dangerous," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I heard he was asking about old matters, family histories, even deaths from years past. Thomas Granger, for instance." She let the name drop softly, watching Laura's reaction. The widow's face remained composed, but her eyes flickered, like a candle caught in a draught. "Thomas Granger?" she said, her tone light but strained. "I barely knew the family. I only moved here after my husband's death." She set her cup down, her hand steady now, but Miss Marple saw the effort it took. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Though it's curious, isn't it, how past events linger. Dr. Hayworth seemed to think there was something amiss about Thomas's accident. He was asking about medicines, poisons even, at the chemist's shop." She paused, her eyes on the locket. "You never visited Willow Cottage, I suppose?" Laura's fingers closed around the locket, her knuckles whitening. "No," she said, too quickly. "I had no reason to. Dr. Hayworth and I spoke only once since he arrived, at the church fete. He mentioned my husband, but that was all." Her voice was calm, but Miss Marple caught the faintest tremor, like a thread pulled taut. The conversation turned to village matters, the church fund, the autumn fair, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. Laura's denial was too swift, her composure too carefully maintained. The locket, she suspected, was a clue, perhaps holding the initials LB, or a connection to Thomas Granger. She recalled a case from her youth when a young woman's locket had revealed a secret lover leading to a tragic end. Laura Belling, she thought, was hiding something, and Dr. Hayworth's questions had threatened to expose it. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by the mantel, her fingers brushing the roses. "Such lovely flowers," she said. "You must have a knack for gardening. I've seen you walking near Thornfield. Those grounds are so wild, aren't they?" She smiled, watching Laura's reaction. The widow's face tightened, but she recovered quickly. "I walk there sometimes," she said. "The paths are quiet, good for thinking." But her eyes avoided Miss Marple's, and her hand strayed to the locket again. Outside, the air was cooler, the sun dipping behind the hills. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the day's observations. Laura Belling's guarded manner, her connection to Dr. Hayworth in London, and her walks near Thornfield suggested she was more entangled in the mystery than she admitted. The locket, she was certain, held a clue, but without seeing it, she could only speculate. She thought of Leonard Baxter's fear, Mrs. Granger's defensiveness, and Eleanor's haunted eyes, and wondered how they all fit together. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed but her mind far from idle. She took out the scrap of paper with LB and studied it under the lamplight. The ink, she noted, was the same shade as that used in Dr. Hayworth's typewriter, suggesting the note was written in his study. But by whom? Laura Belling, Leonard Baxter, or someone else? She thought of Mr. Tate, the former chemist, and his sudden departure after Thomas Granger's death. Had he supplied cyanide to someone with the initials LB? And had Dr. Hayworth's inquiries threatened to expose a long-buried truth? As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a parallel case from her girlhood, when a widow in her village had been implicated in a poisoning, her secret revealed by a letter hidden in a locket. "People are so careless," she murmured, her needles clicking softly. "They guard their secrets, but they always leave a trace." She resolved to speak with Inspector Craddock about the diary, hoping it might shed light on Dr. Hayworth's final days. But first, she would need to tread carefully, for the person who had silenced the doctor was still in St. Mary Mead, watching, waiting. Chapter 7. The Unlocked Diary. The late September dusk settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft grey shawl, softening the edges of the village as lights flickered on in cottage windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in her sitting room, the glow of her reading lamp casting a warm circle over the table where her knitting lay neglected. Her visit to Laura Belling had added new threads to the tapestry of Dr. Clarence Hayworth's death, but the pattern was still incomplete. The widow's guarded manner, her nervous touch on the locket, and her admission of walks near Thornfield Manor had deepened Miss Marple's suspicions. The initials LB on the scrap of paper, now tucked safely in her desk drawer, seemed to point to Laura or Leonard Baxter, but she sensed a larger truth, one tied to the Granger family and the long-ago death of Thomas Granger. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, his face weary, but his eyes alert. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. We found the key to Dr. Hayworth's diary, hidden in a hollowed-out book in his study. I thought you might like to see it before we send it to the Yard." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. "How thoughtful, Inspector," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I'm sure it will be most illuminating." She poured him tea, her movements as precise as her thoughts, and listened as he described the find. The diary, a slim leather volume, had been locked in a drawer, but the key, overlooked in the initial search, was discovered in a copy of Gray's Anatomy, its spine hollowed to conceal it. "It's clear he wanted to protect it," Craddock said, setting the diary on the table. "I'd value your thoughts, if you've a moment." Miss Marple opened the diary, her fingers careful on the worn pages. The entries, written in Dr. Hayworth's precise hand, began with his arrival in St. Mary Mead, noting the village's quiet charm and his hope for a peaceful retirement. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted, growing terse, almost urgent. He wrote of his suspicion that Thomas Granger's death, 10 years prior, was no accident but a deliberate act, possibly involving cyanide. The symptoms described in the inquest report, convulsions, sudden collapse, suggest poison, he wrote. "I must find the truth, though it may cost me." Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their soft clicking, paused as she read on. Dr. Hayworth had visited Thornfield, confronting Mrs. Granger about a letter he had found among old medical records in London, one implicating LB in the purchase of cyanide from Mr. Tate, the former chemist. "Mrs. G denies all knowledge, but her fear was palpable," he noted. "Eleanor pleaded with me to drop the matter, saying it would ruin them. I cannot, in conscience, stay silent." The final entry, dated the day before his death, was chilling. "I have proof now, but I am watched. If anything happens to me, the letter is hidden at Thornfield, in a place only I know." Miss Marple closed the diary, her mind racing. "This changes things, Inspector," she said softly. "Dr. Hayworth believed Thomas Granger was murdered, and he died for it. The letter he mentions, have you searched Thornfield?" Craddock shook his head. "Not yet. Mrs. Granger is uncooperative, and we need a warrant. But this diary suggests she, or her daughter, had reason to silence him." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else. We found a smudge of rouge on the windowsill at Willow Cottage. Faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't there when we first examined the scene." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. though her smile remained gentle. "Rouge," she murmured. "How curious." She thought of Laura Belling, whose lips bore a subtle shade of crimson, and Eleanor Granger, whose pale face was unadorned, but whose nervous hands might have touched a cosmetic in haste. The smudge was a clue, but to whom? She handed the diary back to Craddock, advising him to keep it safe. "You might ask Mrs. Granger about that letter," she said, "and perhaps check the chemist's records, if any remain from Mr. Tate's time." After Craddock left, Miss Marple sat by her window, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the diary's revelations. The letter at Thornfield was the key, she was certain, but finding it would require tact. She recalled Eleanor's glance at the locked drawer in the drawing room and wondered if it held the letter, or something else. The mention of L.B. in the diary pointed to Laura Belling or Leonard Baxter, but it could also be an alias, a name from the past. She thought of a case from her youth, when a hidden letter had exposed a family's shame, leading to a desperate act. "People are so predictable," she murmured, her needles resuming their rhythm. The next morning, Miss Marple decided to return to the village hall, where the parish records were kept, hoping to trace Mr. Tate's activities 10 years ago. The hall was quiet, save for the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, sorting hymnals. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, her face brightening. "Are you here about the church fund?" "Not today," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I was wondering about old records. Around the time of Thomas Granger's death, Dr. Hayworth was interested in them, I believe." Mrs. Clement nodded, leading her to a dusty cupboard where the parish registers were stored. The pages were brittle, some missing, but Miss Marple's patient fingers found an entry from the month of Thomas's death, a visitor's signature, L. Barlow, noted as a guest at Thornfield. The name was unfamiliar, but the initials caught her attention. Could L.B. be Barlow, not Belling or Baxter? She thanked Mrs. Clement and walked home, her mind turning over the new clue. Barlow was not a name known in St. Mary Mead, but visitors often left traces, and Thornfield's guestbook might hold more. She resolved to ask Mrs. Bantry, whose memory for village visitors was almost as sharp as her own. That afternoon, over tea at the Bantry's sprawling manor, Miss Marple broached the subject. "Do you recall a guest at Thornfield about 10 years ago named Barlow?" she asked, passing a scone. Mrs. Bantry frowned, her mind sifting through years of gossip. "Barlow. It rings a bell. Wasn't there a young woman, a cousin or friend of the Grangers, who stayed for a summer? I think she was called Lucy or Laura, something like that. Left suddenly after Thomas's accident." She paused, her eyes widening. "Jane, do you think she's L.B.? Oh, this is getting positively sinister." Miss Marple smiled, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Lucy Barlow, if she existed, could be the key to the cyanide purchase, perhaps acting for the Grangers or against them. She recalled Laura Belling's guarded manner and wondered if she had once been Laura Barlow, her past hidden behind a new name. The locket, she thought, might hold the answer, but confronting Laura directly would be premature. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, a commotion broke the village's quiet. A neighbour rushed to her door, breathless. "Miss Marple, it's Eleanor Granger. She's been seen leaving Thornfield with a suitcase, heading for the station." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained calm. Eleanor's flight was no surprise. Fear drove people to desperate acts, and the diary's revelations had likely pushed her to the edge. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, urging him to intercept Eleanor before she boarded the train. "She may know where the letter is," she said, her voice steady, "and she may not be alone." As she hung up, Miss Marple's mind turned to the smudge of rouge, the locked drawer, and the name Barlow. The pieces were falling into place, but the final pattern was still hidden. She picked up her knitting, her needles clicking softly, and waited for the truth to unravel. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. The evening air in St. Mary Mead was thick with the scent of wood smoke As Miss Jane Marple made her way to the vicarage, her black handbag clutched firmly in one hand. The village, usually so tranquil, buzzed with the news of Eleanor Granger's attempted flight from Thornfield Manor. Inspector Craddock had intercepted her at the station, her suitcase half packed with clothes and a few papers, her face pale with fear. Miss Marple, informed by a breathless Mrs. Clement, had suggested a gathering at the vicarage to unravel the mystery of Dr. Clarence Haworth's death. "It's time," she had said to Craddock over the telephone, her voice calm but resolute, "to lay the truth bare." The vicarage parlour was a cosy room, its walls lined with books and its hearth aglow with a modest fire. Inspector Craddock stood by the window, his notebook in hand, while Mrs. Bantry perched on a chintz sofa, her eyes bright with anticipation. Mrs. Granger sat rigidly in an armchair, her silver hair gleaming under the lamplight, her face a mask of defiance. Eleanor, beside her, looked small and fragile, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Leonard Baxter, summoned from his chemist's shop, stood near the door, his spectacles glinting nervously. Laura Belling, the last to arrive, sat apart, her dark hair framing a face that betrayed no emotion, though her fingers brushed the locket at her throat. Miss Marple, seated in a straight-backed chair, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, surveyed the room with her mild, piercing gaze. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of authority. "Dr. Haworth's death has troubled us all, and I believe we can now understand why he died, and who is responsible." She paused, letting the silence settle, her eyes resting briefly on each face. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, leaned forward. "Jane, you've solved it, haven't you? It's murder. I knew it." Inspector Craddock shot her a quelling look, but Miss Marple's smile was indulgent. "Let us begin with Dr. Haworth," she said. "A man of curiosity, perhaps too much for his own good. He came to St. Mary Mead seeking peace, but his past as a physician led him to a mystery, the death of Thomas Granger 10 years ago." Mrs. Granger's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Eleanor's hands stilled, her eyes wide. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but relentless. "Thomas's death was ruled an accident, a fall from a horse, but Dr. Haworth suspected otherwise. He found evidence in old medical records, symptoms suggesting cyanide poisoning. He began asking questions, visiting Thornfield, speaking to Mr. Baxter, and even inquiring about Mrs. Belling's past in London. His diary, which Inspector Craddock kindly shared, revealed his discovery of a letter implicating someone with the initials LB in the purchase of cyanide from Mr. Tate, the former chemist." Baxter shifted, his face pale, but Miss Marple's eyes moved to Laura Belling. "Mrs. Belling, you knew Dr. Haworth in London when he treated your husband, Richard. You told me he was curious, perhaps meddlesome. Did he ask you about Thomas Granger?" Laura's fingers tightened on her locket, but her voice was steady. "He mentioned it once, at the fete. I told him I knew nothing." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Baxter. "Mr. Baxter, you were less forthcoming. When Dr. Haworth asked about cyanide purchases, you claimed the records were gone. But you were afraid, weren't you? Afraid he was getting too close to the truth." Baxter's hands trembled and he stammered. I told you I had nothing to do with it." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "I believe you, Mr. Baxter, in part. You sold cyanide years ago to someone using the initials LB, not for pest control, but for something far darker." She turned to Mrs. Granger, whose face was now ashen. "Mrs. Granger, Dr. Haworth confronted you about a letter he found, hidden at Thornfield. It was in a locked drawer in your drawing room, wasn't it? The drawer Eleanor glanced at when I visited." Eleanor gasped, her handkerchief falling to the floor. Mrs. Granger's voice was cold. "This is nonsense, Miss Marple. My son's death was an accident. Dr. Haworth was mistaken, and his death was his own doing. Miss Marple shook her head, her voice soft but unyielding. I'm afraid not. Dr. Hayworth was poisoned, his brandy laced with cyanide. The open window, the smudge of rouge on the sill, and the absence of fingerprints suggest someone entered Willow Cottage, someone who knew how to avoid detection. And Eleanor's attempt to flee confirms her fear of the truth coming out. She paused, her eyes on Mrs. Granger. Thomas was a troubled young man, reckless, in debt, a threat to the Granger name. You, Mrs. Granger, could not bear the shame. 10 years ago, you obtained cyanide using the initials L.B. Laura Barlow, your maiden name before you married Mr. Granger. You poisoned Thomas, making it look like an accident. Dr. Tate, the chemist, suspected but left the village, perhaps paid to keep silent. Dr. Hayworth, years later, uncovered the truth and confronted you. To protect your secret, you poisoned him, with Eleanor's help. Eleanor sobbed, her face buried in her hands. Mrs. Granger's composure cracked, her voice rising. This is outrageous. You have no proof. But Miss Marple continued, her tone calm. The letter, hidden in the drawer, names Laura Barlow as the buyer of cyanide, and the rouge on the windowsill matches the shade Eleanor wears, a shade she applied in haste that night to steady her nerves. You both entered Willow Cottage, using your knowledge of the house from Thomas's time. Laura Belling spoke at last, her voice sharp. And what of me? You've accused everyone else. Miss Marple's eyes softened. You were a red herring, Mrs. Belling. Your initials fit, and your past with Dr. Hayworth raised suspicions. But your locket holds only a photograph of your husband. You walked near Thornfield, perhaps out of curiosity, but you did not kill Dr. Hayworth. Mrs. Granger stood, her face contorted. Enough. I did it for my family. Thomas was ruining us, and Hayworth would have destroyed what was left. Her confession hung in the air, and Eleanor's sobs grew louder. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. Mrs. Granger, Eleanor, you'll need to come with me. As the room emptied, Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm. Jane, you're a marvel. How did you know? Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting. People are so predictable, Dolly. They guard their secrets, but they always leave a trace. The village settled back into its quiet rhythm, and Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, the pattern complete at last.